Hello, everyone. My name is Shawn Kim. I'm an assistant professor of accounting at University of California, Berkeley. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the conference organizers and Peter for inviting our paper to the conference. Today, I'm excited to present my paper, co-authored with Xiaoyan Jiang at New York University and Shirley Liu at Harvard Business School on the accountability of corporate emission reduction targets. With growing stakeholder concerns over climate change, firms are increasingly announcing targets to reduce their emissions. And as you can see from the slide, these emission reduction targets often make media headline, and it is considered as one of the most important voluntary disclosure about firms' current and future environmental performance. However, what is often missing in the discussion about corporate emission reduction targets is the discussion about the outcomes and consequences of these targets. And understandably, this gap is mainly driven by the long horizon of these emission reduction targets, because many of these targets are expiring in 2030 or 2050, leaving us with more than a decade until the final outcome of these targets are realized. So in this paper, we studied that gap. We studied the accountability around corporate emission reduction targets by focusing exclusively on targets that expired in 2020. Using that sample, we asked the following three questions. First, what happened to the targets that ended in 2020? How many of them are achieved and how many of them failed? Second, how transparent are target outcomes? Are the information about target outcomes transparently disclosed and easily available to obtain? Third, what are the consequences of failing these targets? Did companies that missed their targets suffer any negative consequences? We believe that studying the consequences and accountability of 2020 emission targets provide important insight about targets that are set to expire in 2030, 2040, and 2050. We also believe that this study is directly related to the issue of greenwashing. If you imagine a firm trying to decide whether or not to announce a target, you can't imagine this company weighing the scale, where on the one side, they have the immediate benefit amount on announcing these targets, including the improved public perception, and the other hand is the potential cost of missing these targets. However, without real accountability, there's no real cost of missing these targets, and this scale will be broken. And we can expect that any company that expects even the slightest benefit of announcing these targets will do so, but will end up with an equilibrium with a lot of empty promises. Conceptually, we'd like to compare corporate emission reduction targets with another important targets that firms voluntarily set, which is their earnings targets. It is very well established that for earnings targets, there is strong accountability around them. Firms, when missing earnings targets, suffer severe consequences, including negative market reaction, negative media coverage, and even manager turnover. And we see that managers try hard to meet those targets, as documented by the high frequency of just above zero earnings and just above Wall Street consensus earnings. In this setting, we're less concerned about managers window dressing or trying to portray an optimistic financial view about the company through ambitious earnings targets, which is exactly what we would like to see for emission reduction targets as well. Now, looking at earnings targets and emission targets side by side, we see that there are a lot of supporting institutions surrounding earnings targets. US GAAP and other reporting standards standardize the disclosure of financial information. Auditors verify the financial information, and SEC enforces misreporting. We also have analysts actively covering this information and investors responding to it. Now, if you think about emissions targets, the supporting institution, we're not so sure about that. The reporting standards for environmental information is still in development. The external verification of that information is weak, and it is unclear who is monitoring and actively covering companies' carbon performance and their progress toward these targets. To study the outcomes and accountability of emission reduction targets, we again focus exclusively on targets that expired, that ended in 2020. We also add additional requirements for targets to make sure that we're looking at significant organizational level long-term emission targets. After applying these filters, we end up with a sample of 1,041 firms with such 2020 emission targets. And collectively, these firms' Scope 1 emissions cover 5% of global emissions. You might ask, why 2020 targets? Isn't 2050 targets the most important ultimate goal that we should care about? While I agree that 2020 targets are the most important targets, we argue that we simply cannot wait until 2050 to study the outcomes and accountability of emission reduction targets. It would simply be too late. Descriptively, we also see that companies often set emission reduction targets that are due at the end of each decade. So targets ending in 2020, 2030, 40, and 50. So 2020 is the first year in which we get to observe the final outcomes of companies' long-term emission reduction targets in a large sample. Therefore, we believe that it is a great setting to study the outcomes and accountability of emission reduction targets. To answer our first research question, we first show what happened to these targets. Of the 1,041 2020 targets, 61% of them were achieved and 9% of them failed. Interestingly, 31% of these targets disappeared. And by disappeared, we mean that these companies disclosed their 2020 targets in earlier annual disclosure and at some point stopped disclosing their progress toward these targets and did not disclose the final outcome of these targets in 2020 disclosure. So for these disappeared companies, unless you compare 2020 emission with the targeted emission from earlier annual disclosure yourself, you will not be able to tell the target outcomes. These disappeared companies are an interesting bunch. Upon deeper investigation, it seemed to us that the disappeared companies are a mix of two groups. First group of firms are firms that silently dropped emission reduction targets potentially upon assessing a higher likelihood of failure. And there's the second group of firms which seem to be updating 2020 targets with more ambitious 2030 or future targets. And consistent with that view, we find that the annual emission reduction rate is highest for achieved companies, followed by disappeared companies, and then failed companies. Acknowledging that disappeared companies may be a sum of two groups of firms, in our future analysis, we divide disappeared companies into two groups, leaders and laggards, based on their industry-adjusted emission reductions. We also provide some descriptive on how target outcomes vary across industry. Industry with the highest target achievements are healthcare and financial. And industry with the lowest target achievement are materials and energy. The fact that we're seeing a lot of carbon-intensive industries on the bottom side of this plot may be concerning because it is the target from those companies that may have the most impact. Next, we examine how the information about target outcome is disclosed and disseminating. From previous slide, we already saw that nearly 1/3 of the targets disappeared, already speaking to the lack of transparency in target outcomes. However, for this analysis, we focus on 88 companies with failed emission reduction targets, and we look at their disclosure to see how they disclose that information. So for the 88 companies with failed emission reduction targets, we manually go through their ESG report. And we found that only 33.3% of the firms acknowledged their 2020 target failure in their ESG reports, and only 20% of them explicitly acknowledged their target failure using language such as failed or missed. So after seeing the firms themselves are not so transparent about their target failure, we move on to the role of media. Even if firms are not transparently disclosing their failure, media could play a role in digging up this information and disseminating it to the wider audience. So again, through a manual search, we identified 51 media articles related to 2020 target outcomes, of which 48 of them are related to target achievement and only 3 related to target failure. To a greater disappointment, we find that the 3 companies with media coverage of failed targets were those that acknowledged their failure in the ESG report. This suggests that while media seem to disseminating target failure to some degree, its role in identifying failed companies and improving the transparency of target outcomes seems very limited. And if we compare this with the media coverage of the initial announcement of 2020 targets, we find that media is much more likely to cover the initial announcement of targets and target outcomes. Overall, the role of media in improving the transparency and accountability of emission reduction targets seems questionable, given that they seem to cover more of what the firms would like them to cover, the initial announcement of these targets and target achievements. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we investigate the consequences of failed emission reduction targets. So we focus on responses by potential targets of these emission reduction targets. So we look at market reaction, the response from ESG rating agency, the response from the media, and also environmental shareholder proposal. Across all of these different outcomes, we failed to find significant evidence to suggest that firms that failed or disappeared their targets suffered any negative consequences. So first, looking at the market response, we identified information events related to the release of 2020 target outcomes and failed to find any significant difference among failed, achieved, or disappeared companies. The result is similar when we look at other potential outcomes. We do not observe that companies with failed or disappeared targets had more environmental shareholder proposal, negative media sentiment, or lower ESG ratings compared to firms that achieved their targets. And while we point to the lack of a supporting institution around emission targets to provide transparency and oversight as the main cause of the lack of consequences, we acknowledge that there could be other drivers, alternate explanation to the lack of consequences. A potential alternative explanation is that failed targets are more difficult, therefore stakeholders are okay with these companies failing these targets. So what we do is we divide failed targets into more ambitious and less ambitious ones and examine their consequences separately. And again, across both groups, we do not find significant evidence to suggest that failed firms suffer any negative consequences. Our sample period overlaps with COVID, so maybe stakeholders are okay with firms missing these targets when firms are going through such a severe shock. Therefore, we test only keeping industry that are less affected by COVID. Again, there we do not find any significant consequences. Finally, another possibility is that market and other stakeholders already responded to the information about the firm's target progress. That is, they already knew that the company is going to miss a target in 2020, earlier, say in 2018 or 2019. To address that, we construct the measure of the likelihood of target failure for 2018 and 2019 for all of the firms, and examine whether market or other stakeholders responded to that information in earlier years. Here again, we do not find evidence to suggest that market and stakeholders responded to the information about the likelihood of target failure. So overall, we observe that there is lack of penalties for missing targets. Now we contrast that with the potential benefits that firms may enjoy by announcing these targets. So we examined the same outcomes around the firm's initial announcements of 2020 targets and find that firms receive higher ESG ratings and more positive media sentiment following the announcement of these targets. So our results collectively suggest that companies may be able to enjoy a free lunch, enjoying the benefits of announcing these targets without having to pay any penalties for missing these targets. To conclude, we find limited accountability on emission reduction targets that expired in 2020. Target outcomes are not disclosed transparently, and companies that failed or silently removed their targets did not suffer any negative consequences. This is in direct contrast with improved ESG rating and media sentiment following the announcement of 2020 targets. Our findings provide insight into emission targets that will expire in the future. We draw a parallel to the earnings target and suggest the role of institutions supporting the accountability of emission reduction targets. That's it for me. Thank you very much.